So this session is Your Library's Greatest Hits. We have Sophie Hollis, our Community Engagement Librarian at NC Live, leading this session, and I'll have her take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Devin, and thanks everyone for tuning in this afternoon to watch this session. I'm really excited. So there are going to be a couple interactive pieces to today's session. So if we can go ahead and go to the next slide, we'll have some instructions for joining the Mentimeter. So it should have a QR code there. And then you can also see this link. If you go to menti.com, you can enter this code and then you'll join the presentation. And there's just going to be a few interactive questions that I would love to hear everyone's thoughts on. So if at any point you get kicked off of the Mentimeter, the code should stay at the top there. So you can always go to menti.com and use the code. So I'll give everyone 1 minute to log on, since I know we all just got on a Zoom and now you're going to have to get on a Mentimeter too. But it's worth it. Okay. Oh yeah, and thanks, Devin, for putting that in the chat. Okay. So we can go ahead and get started. As many of you know, hello, I'm Sophie Hollis. I'm the Community Engagement Librarian at NC Live. In general, I'm responsible for marketing and communications at NC Live. And the reason I wanted to do this session for this series is because one of my jobs is to create the ROI, which is return on investment documents at the end of the year. We also call them the end of year documents or year in review documents. If this sounds familiar, it's probably because you are a library director and that's who we send these documents to. If not, I'm going to have pictures of these later on in the presentation, so you'll get to see what they look like. But that is one of the big parts of my job, is figuring out how to communicate to libraries how much money NC Live saved you, as well as specific stats about like your e-resource usage and our training program. And the point of these documents is really to tell libraries what the value of NC Live is. And it's also for those libraries to be able to provide justification to their own stakeholders about why NC Live is so valuable. So we try to design these in a way that if, for example, a campus administrator came to you and said, like, what the heck is NC Live and why are we paying for it? This document can show like, well, here's the cost savings and here's everything we get out of our membership. So that's the kind of document that this is, and I figured that that kind of communication can be useful for individual libraries as well. So that was what sort of inspired the session. Another big part of my job is to collect testimonials from library patrons to kind of show the impact that our resources are having. And we'll talk about this more, but as much as I think the quantitative data is very important to show the scale of the impact that we have, I also think it makes it a lot easier to communicate how valuable that is when you have specific examples and stories that really illustrate the impact on a particular person. It kind of humanizes it and makes it more interesting. So I'll go over some of the ways that we collect those testimonials. And that's an area where we're trying to grow and get better. So would also love to invite conversation about better ways to do that, or how y'all are doing that in your libraries. And then finally, I want to talk about designing a funding one-pager or other materials and how I do that with these documents to try to get you started on thinking about what should these final products actually look like once I'm ready to make them. So I think we're ready for the next slide here. These are going to be some examples. So you can see here on the left side is the funding, the ROI end of year document that we make. That's what I was referencing in the last slide. So you can see here that we really feature our cost savings as like the biggest thing. This one is for the entire consortium, so that's what this data is reflecting. So you can see we look at this huge number, but we also show it graphically to kind of show how much that savings actually looks like compared to the full cost. I'll kind of get more into that when I talk about design elements, but that's something to just notice. And then you can also see in the top right-hand corner, we have this 209 member libraries box. That box on most of our documents is actually specific to the library that we send it to. And that's where we put a library's individual e-resource usage, their top 3 resources, and any of the NC Live services that they use. And that's how we kind of make it more customized and more relevant to the library. So we actually have these available on our website if you were interested in downloading them. I'm going to put some links in the chat. So this one is for the consortial total, but you can also look for your particular COI. So if you wanted to see, for example, just the public libraries, that one's available on our site. And so you can kind of look at this and get your own sense of what this would look like. And then the other example I have here is more of a general one-pager that we made that serves several purposes. So the main thing is that it tries to explain NC Live to more of a lay audience of like external stakeholders. And we tried to make a couple different versions of this for different audiences. So we have one that's specific to like community college administrators and one that's specific to public library patrons. So this is something that we've been experimenting with a little bit over the past year. And I just wanted to show it as another example of a way to communicate your value with your data. And these are also on our website, so I'm going to put these links in the chat as well. 1 second. And we actually have a customizable version that has placeholder templates for patron stories. If anyone is interested in using this and putting their own patron stories in it, you're welcome to do that. So I would encourage everyone to look at our promotional materials page and some of these examples if you want to take a closer look at them. Okay, next slide. So these are some examples of the patron testimonials that I was talking about. So these are all listed on our impact site, which you can see at the bottom there is nclive.org/impact. We're actually in the process of kind of editing and revamping that page, but these testimonials as well as a few others are on there. So you can kind of see examples of what I mean when I'm talking about patron testimonials. I'm going to get more into these later, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows where to find them. It's nclive.org/impact. So next slide. So for today's presentation, I really wanted to talk about, first of all, the types of data that are useful for storytelling and how we collect them at NC Live, potentially how you could collect them if you also wanted to use those same data points. Then I want to talk about the types of materials that are useful for communicating your library's value. This is, again, another kind of open point. We are also exploring what the most useful materials are to have. Obviously, the ones I showed you already, I've shown you a website and a couple of flyers, and those have been great for us, but there might be other types of things that might be more useful to your library specifically, so we can talk about those. And then I'll end with a couple tips for design and storytelling, just showing you how I get started on these documents and how I get them to look the way that they look. So I think we're ready for the next slide. Thank you. Great. So I also just wanted to touch on why this is all important. Like, why should you be communicating your library's value? And I'm guessing if you all tuned into this webinar, you probably already agree with me that this is an important thing to do, but it definitely helps to just kind of reiterate why it's worth spending your time on. So something that we've been hearing a lot from our member libraries is just general anxiety about the future, especially when it comes to funding or staffing and filling positions. There's just a lot that we don't know that's coming up. And so we really need to be sure that we're communicating how critical libraries are to our larger communities so that we can be prepared for whatever the future holds. One thing that I notice in talking to patrons especially is that we as library staff all know how critical libraries are to the communities that we serve, but a lot of people outside of libraries don't always know that. So it's really important that we are able to communicate that well and to do that in a way that actually is going to resonate with our intended audience. So whether or not you're approaching this from a funding perspective, I think it's really important to advocate for your library and its work and hope that when our libraries actually do encounter challenges, our communities and the decision makers in them will already be thinking about the library as critically important because you had these materials ready. So that's, I think, whether or not you're facing an immediate crisis, it's really good to have this stuff just in case. The other thing that I think is important about communicating your library's value is making sure that you can help build relationships with the decision makers in your community. So even if there's not something wrong or something that your library needs, communicating the value of your library to important decision makers might make them think like, oh, the library might benefit from X opportunity or X partnership. So these things can kind of help keep your library top of mind for those important decision makers. And then they'll be thinking about you as opportunities come along. All right, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so part one is finding data. And to do this, I wanted to kind of talk about what NC Live does primarily. So we can go to the next slide. To do the NC Live ROI, basically what we do is we start from this collaborative process that helps really distribute the work in the early stages. So what we'll do is create this big spreadsheet, usually around November, sometimes December, at the end of the year to really start listing everything that we did in the past year that might be valuable. And we don't really have like a standard or a filter at this stage. We just list out everything that could possibly be relevant. So of course, we always look into the return on investment for each of our communities of interest. I realize there's a lot of acronyms in this presentation, and I apologize for that. So COI is community of interest, and that's just a segment of the libraries that we serve. For example, public libraries or the UNC system schools. So we always look on our return on investment for each of those because that is really our bread and butter as a library consortium. Like that's one of the main points of value that we offer. So that's always on there. But then we also like to think about the major milestones over the last year. Typically that includes, any collections that we added, or it could be special events that we did. So for example, we might put the Communicating Value series on there if that's something that turns out to be really popular and useful for our libraries, just to remind folks that we did that. Or we might put things like that are big topics in the library world. So for example, we might put something about AI literacy on there for this year because that's been talked about so much. So we just start listing out major milestones and ways that we contributed to them over the past year. Of course, we also look at our collections and usage data by library. I'm sure most of you know this, but just to put in a plug here, if you are interested in your library's usage data or any of the usage data of your peer libraries, you can download that on our usage reports page. So that's always a good source for you if you're looking for e-resource data. And then we also compile all of our training and marketing and services stats. So I'm sure many of y'all order our print materials. We put that on there. We look at how much training people attended, how many videos were watched, how many of Devon's awesome tutorials people are taking. So we try to really get a wide variety of all of the NC Live services and offerings to see which ones emerge as big milestones that might be really impressive. So we'll give you an example of this on the next page. This is made up, but just to kind of give you a visual illustration of what I'm talking about, we all start brainstorming these categories, which are in this leftmost column. So for example, we might look at the number of databases if that's changed. I always look at annual conference stats because that's a big part of what I do. I mentioned some of these other ones in the last one, but anything that could possibly show NC Live's value to our member libraries, we just list it out. And then this is what I was talking about in terms of dividing up the work to make it a little bit more manageable so that one person's not doing all of this, but we assign a person to each category to collect that data. And we assign that based on kind of expertise area. So you can see in like this fake example, annual conference is something I organize. So I'm the person most likely to have those stats. Devon's most likely to have training stats, etc. So we just sort of divide this up and figure out what each point of data is for each category. And then once we have all of these put together is when we can start to kind of whittle it down and decide which of these are most impressive, most relevant to our communities, etc. Okay. So what kinds of data do we put in this chart, or what kinds of data do we use? I'll also say that I have been going through the NC Live Student Success course that Devon made in partnership with Becky Croxton, who is at UNC Charlotte. And some of these examples are from that course because Becky is an amazing data expert and has great ideas. So that's where some of these are coming from. But obviously, a big one that NC Live uses is resource usage. So we primarily look at full text views, sometimes searches, depending on the database. And for other library examples, that might be something like circulation. So I'm thinking of the literal numbers of collections that could be used here. And then another big category for us is event participation. We have obviously trainings and webinars that we count up the attendance for that and the registration, as well as things like how many recorded sessions did people watch or how many tutorials did they take. And so for other libraries or individual library contexts, this could also be something like instruction sessions or research consultations. Another thing that we like to look at, or that not that NC Live likes to look at, but that we've heard from member libraries is useful, is your facilities use. So obviously this doesn't apply to us since we're all digital collections, but this can be really great, especially if you're focusing on a message about how your library needs more physical space. Meeting room bookings and facilities use is a great way to communicate the need that's happening in your library. And then another kind of broader category that I think could help underline or emphasize particular points that you're trying to make is looking at the institutional or county context, like your demographics in your county, and as well as that data by group. So if you're trying to say, for example, that the library is critical to supporting faculty research, then I think you can really focus in on data points that include your faculty. Maybe that's consultations, maybe that's instruction sessions or being embedded in classes. I guess that's more kind of student success stuff, but you could also look at research appointments for faculty members, et cetera. So just kind of thinking about the types of data that are going to support the overall story that you want to make. And then, of course, the red arrow here for qualitative data, like testimonials, I want to get into kind of on its own. So that's why that's different. But like I said, those can really add a little bit of color and storytelling to these quantitative data points. So I think that deserves a little bit more focus. One example that I'll share on this that I heard about at our in-person workshop on Friday is that somebody counted up how many times their meeting rooms were being used for meetings. And then they also counted all of the times that somebody tried to use a meeting room, but it was already booked. And so they had that extra piece to show how badly they needed another meeting room because they were counting both of those. So I just thought that was a great example that I wanted to share with everyone else as well. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to mention that I touched on a little bit is customizing your documents to make sure that they're actually impactful to your audience. So for us, once we have our possible categories on that big Excel sheet, we start to think about which ones our audience are most likely to care about, and that's kind of how we narrow it down. So for example, we used to list the types of libraries that ordered print materials, like we would say, like, this is made up. 40% of public libraries ordered our materials, or like 50% of our orders were from public libraries, which is cool. But we decided that what was actually more impactful was to put the total number of orders or total number of materials that were actually ordered through our system, because then that kind of gives you a sense of across the board, like what's the volume of the service actually being used. So yeah, that's just one of the ways that we like look at all this particular data in a particular area and decide like this one's going to show the volume or the impact a little bit more effectively than some of these other stats. So another thing that we do that I mentioned is we put our total savings by community as sort of the main stat because that's our primary goal as a consortium. So that's also what I would encourage you to do as you think about which data you want to feature, is think about what is the most important thing in the eyes of your audience that your library does. So maybe it's reducing costs for attending school for your students. Maybe it's how you're supporting research, or maybe it's that you're directing people to local services or supporting small businesses in your area. There can be so many different focuses for what you want to communicate. So depending on what you want to choose, that can kind of help you figure out which pieces of data to feature most prominently. So I'll also give a little disclaimer that NC Live is actually working on this problem right now and trying to figure out what some of the main goals of our different library communities are. And so just to kind of give you a sense of what we've been hearing or some of the things that we might be focusing on as examples, workforce development, healthcare careers specifically, AI literacy, student success. So those are some messages that we might be focusing on our future materials as examples. So I think the next slide is a question for you all, finally. See if you've been paying attention. Right, so like I said, we're interested in what your priorities are, and I gave you a few examples, but I'm curious to hear what are some of the top priorities for the communities that you're serving right now? And if for some reason the Mentimeter is not working for you, feel free to put it in the chat as well. Okay, great. I'm seeing some good ones coming up that so far are sounding very familiar, so I'll just kind of read some out here. The digital divide, I would say that one right next to like technological literacy is really big for us too. We've been hearing that a lot. I'm seeing retention and student success, workforce development, connecting folks to community resources, offering spaces for people. Let's see, raising money for renovation and expansion, access to materials at a reasonable cost. Yes, a lot of these are looking really, really familiar. Enrollment, yeah. So I'm jumping around here because I'm seeing a lot of similar and overlapping topics, which is great. But yeah, so hopefully just like brainstorming this for a second can give you a sense of like, here are some things that I could potentially be emphasizing in my data story when I'm talking to stakeholders in my community. All right, let's see what's next. Okay, so testimonials, we're finally here. How does NC Live get our user stories? We've tried a couple of different methods for this, and some have been more successful than others, so I'll kind of go through these with their various success rates. Excuse me. So the one that generated the most number of testimonials was the first one here, this pop-up survey on our website. So basically what we did is we knew we needed a large quantity of patron testimonials for a particular project. And so when patrons use our website to get to a resource, they always see a splash page that says, "You're on your way to blah, blah, blah," with the NC Live logo. And basically, when they got to that page, a little survey box would pop up and say, "Do you have 5 minutes to talk about NC Live resources?" And if they filled out that survey and rated their satisfaction with NC Live resources as 5 out of 5, which was the maximum, then I reached out to them via email and asked them if I could Zoom interview them for about 10 minutes. And that's how I got a lot of the testimonials that we have. Now, a couple of drawbacks to this. One is that we got a ton of responses that weren't totally usable. Obviously, because we were asking for people's feedback, it is useful feedback to get, and we can do other things with that. But anyone who didn't say, "I'm very satisfied with NC Live resources," and, and there's like a group of those people. Sometimes people were really frustrated and wanted to take the survey because they were feeling frustrated. A lot of those just like weren't usable to follow up on. So of the number of responses that we got, it was cut down significantly if people weren't super excited about NC Live. So it took a large quantity to even get the number of testimonials that we ended up with. Another problem is that we primarily want people to have a good experience using our resources. So we didn't really want to interfere with their experience. So luckily we were able to set this up with Daniel, our web and database development librarian, did this really smart thing where if somebody X'd out of the survey or said they weren't interested, they never got it again. So we wouldn't bother people that way. And I think that was really smart. And the other thing we did was time limit it. So we knew we only were going to run the survey for, I think we did 3 weeks. And after that, we weren't going to bother people again. So I think setting those boundaries on it made it much better for our users' experience because we don't want to like get in their way as they're trying to use our resources. So those are some of the challenges with this particular method. But overall, I would say it got us some of our best stories. The other limitation is that we had no idea what we were getting when people filled out the survey, so it was a little bit harder to target particular kinds of stories. So for example, if student success is something we really wanted to celebrate and highlight, it was hard to figure out, unless they used like an EDU email, who the students were that were responding. So we didn't really know, how to target those specific groups as well. So this one is, again, kind of a wide net that didn't give us everything we needed, but was like a pretty good option. So another thing that we used was recommendations from library staff members. Probably some folks in this room helped us with that, but if we had any library staff members who knew of a particular patron who loves NC Live and really wanted to share their experiences, we just asked that library staff member to connect us with them and then talk to the patron. So those I would say got us probably the highest quality testimonials because they were from very excited patrons and they were through connections that we already had. So those relationships were there, but they are not nearly as numerous. So we just had to wait for the right opportunities to get those. So that makes that one a little bit more challenging. So we also use sometimes help desk cases and anecdotes and feedback to make anonymous testimonials. And this is one that I think that your library can individually assess and decide if it's right for you. We don't use this a ton. It's really just when a good story comes up that we don't really have enough information, or we wouldn't want to give the personal information of the person telling the story. So for example, we get a lot of patron interactions on the help desk where we help them access like language learning, for example. And so that's not like, we wouldn't take the patron's specific identity because they didn't sign up for that, but we can say like a patron in this library system wanted to learn this language and now they can access it through NC Live. So I have an example of this coming up, but that's one way you can do it if you don't want to go through the process of getting the personal information of the patron. The other thing that I'll mention about the patrons that we do feature with their name is that we did go through a pretty rigorous process of making sure they knew what they were signing up for. We asked them to sign a photo release form. So I just want to emphasize like being very clear and careful and respectful if you are going to use real people's stories. And if you don't feel like that's a good process for you, anonymizing it might be a better route. And then the other thing I would say to look for is social media posts. I've seen quite a few random patrons just posting about how much they love their library or a particular event at their library. So that's a great thing to kind of check for and see if you have any fans who are posting about you online, and that might be a good place to start and find stories. Okay, I think the next slide is a couple of examples. Yes, so here we have two examples. One is an actual patron, and Vanessa's story is sort of a funny one because she's maybe one of a very small handful of people who has said, "Oh, where do you work?" And I said, "NC Live." And she was like, "Oh my gosh, I love NC Live." So I knew she would be a great person to ask about, why she loved our resources, if she recognized our brand. Most people just know our resources through their particular library. So that's why I was surprised. So that was just a great happy accident that I was able to talk to her. And she is a Wake County patron, but she also is a Wake Tech community college patron. So she embodied several of or a couple of our communities of interest. So you can see here that I was able to use her picture and her name with permission and use a real quote that she had. So then on the flip side of this, I have an example of an anonymous one. This is the one that I just mentioned that we use from our help desk. But basically, we just wrote a story around a particular instance. It's anonymized. You can see here, this is just a stock photo, but it still gets the point across that our language learning resources are having an impact in particular communities. So these are just a couple of examples to give you a sense of how you can work with what you have to make a story land a little bit more forcefully. Okay, I think next slide, please. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the types of materials that you could be using to share your library's data. So I think we might be on to another question here. Oh no, I'm going to go over some examples first, and then I'll ask you. So you can see here that I'm using this example of an infographic from Chapel Hill Public Library. I actually received this as a patron and just thought it was really well done. But you can see here that at the end of the year, or actually at the beginning of the year, they sent out their end of year review data, and they have things like the number of books that everybody checked out. And then at the bottom, all those little covers are like top 10 books checked out, and then they have them by genre. They also have things like event attendance. And so this was really fun to receive as a patron because I liked seeing like, oh, which books did I read in the top 10? Or like, did I go to this event? Or, how many of the books that I checked out contributed to this total? So I wanted to show this as an example of an infographic, the first thing I have listed here, as something that I thought was really effective. Another thing that could be helpful for you is to have slides or a presentation deck. So just in case you get called into a meeting, like if you usually present your library data at a meeting, it can be helpful to have a template deck that already has a lot of your key storytelling points in it, and then you can just plug in the relevant data or updated data as you need to. Another idea that we've gotten actually from other library consortia is to design talking points. And the hope is that this would help make the messaging really consistent, especially if you're talking about multiple libraries, whether that's within a system or across like a library consortium. But these talking points can just emphasize particular ways that your library helps, specific things. Like maybe there's a point on workforce development, or maybe there's a point on student success. Another thing that you can see throughout this presentation that NC Live has really focused on are these one-pagers or flyers. And the point of these is to very quickly, if someone's just going to glance at it, kind of see the big points. The idea is that, again, if you had a meeting with someone, that's something you can leave behind and they can quickly kind of see all of the key things. Another idea, of course, social media posts so that they're online. And similarly, your website. That one I find has been really helpful, especially for us, because you can direct people to it from all over the place. So you can put the website link on your flyer, you can put it in your slides, and put it in your infographic, and then it's a little bit more static, like you might not have to update it as much, and it's just out there in the world for people to see. Lots of folks also like to do kind of dynamic presentations on their websites where maybe you might click through different options and kind of see graphs growing and things like that. So that can be another way to make it visually engaging, like on a digital platform. And then emails and newsletters obviously are a great way to share this data, and they can be combined with other things. So like this infographic from Chapel Hill Public Library came in a newsletter. So of course they can be combined. And then another idea that I've seen is making short videos, because sometimes people think you're more likely to engage with like a really short video. Maybe there's like some social media TikTok wisdom in that, but that's another option if you have that kind of time and resources to put into a nice video. That can be a nice thing to have on hand as well. Okay, so now I think I'm going to ask you, how is your library sharing your library data right now? All right, I'm seeing some answers coming in here, and I'll keep an eye on the chat as well. I'm seeing several people saying either we don't or we don't know if we do or not, which is totally fair. I think, yeah, there's certainly lots of libraries who might only be doing this at the director level or, in one specific meeting each year. So that could be an opportunity to think about like, well, how could we be sharing this data more often and who needs to be hearing it? I'm also seeing a good mix in here of digital and physical outreach, like social media and website stuff. Excuse me, an annual report, which could, I guess, be either digital or physical, newsletters, at a retreat or at a meeting. That's one I hear a lot as well. Yes, informal meetings and spreadsheets. Yeah. Okay, so I feel like meetings and reporting it, through conversations are one of the things that I didn't mention on my previous slide, and that is certainly important. But I also think it's important to have these materials, whether they are digital or physical materials, to really remind your audience and to help them visualize some of what you're saying. So hopefully the next time you have a meeting where you are presenting library data, some of these things can be helpful to make. Okay. I think ready for the next one. I think I should have some examples here. Yes. Okay. So I have a couple of examples of communicating value outside of NC Live that I thought were really effective and I wanted to highlight. So one that I learned about recently is from NC Digital Futures, which are part of the NC State Cooperative Extension. And basically, they have this whole impact website about how their work supports the communities that they serve, which when I first looked at it, I was like, this is so smart. Like, it's just here all the time. There's tons of impact stories that talk about all these different parts of their mission. And I'll go ahead and share that in the chat as well in case anyone wants to look at it. Let me put this in here. But you can see when you click on that link that it's just a bunch of stories about the lives that they've impacted. And you'll notice that most of those are anonymized. And that's because of the type of work that they do. They don't really want to put the people that they serve in the spotlight in that way. I think a lot of the people they serve also tend to be embarrassed about the questions that they're asking and what they need help with. So they just err on the side of anonymity all the time. And that's why I wanted to show them as an example, just to say, like, you don't have to have a specific person's real information out there to make your point. What they do is they use anecdotes from their staff members, they anonymize them, and then they make these blog posts. And they typically use stock photos, or they use AI images if you want to go down that route cautiously, since they can't use real photos. So that's an example of a way that you can approach this if you feel like you are only getting anecdotal stories from your front desk staff. And then the other example here I have is from another library consortium. So shout out to Pascal. They have some great materials, but basically they have a kit that they can share with libraries that has all kinds of pre-made materials. And this is actually something that NC Live is hoping to do once we kind of know more about what our communities need. But they have printable and digital materials, including this social media post that's on the slide. And this is just a great way for them to take the resources that they have as a consortium and distribute them to libraries who might not have as much time to make individual posts or flyers or things like that. So these are some examples that I wanted to share to kind of give you a sense of how this might look when other groups besides NC Live do it. The thing that I really like about both of these is that they are ready to go. So they're not designed for like a particular meeting or a particular thing. They just work on these regularly and keep the store of materials ready to go for whenever an opportunity arises. And I think that's the best practice to learn from these. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just to kind of review what we've talked about so far, especially in the NC Live process, here it is kind of laid out. First, we brainstorm the data that we can collect and access. And then from that huge list of stuff, we decide which data we want to feature based on the audience we're trying to communicate with and the specific story that we're trying to tell. Then we collect stories that underscore that data and really focus on the person level or story level impact that these big numbers are telling. And then we decide which materials are going to be most effective for this audience. So whether that's slides for a meeting or a report in some form, or maybe we just want to put it on our social media and our website to kind of celebrate it, we decide what's most appropriate for the setting. So the next step is to start drafting. And we can look at the next slide here for the first design tip. So this section is really supposed to be how I kind of sketch out our materials. And maybe you looked at my materials at the beginning and you said, I do not want them to look like that. And that is totally fine. There are lots of ways to make your materials look beautiful, but I wanted to kind of explain the thought process behind what I'm doing so that you can at least consider this perspective and either try it or reject it if it's not working for you. Okay, so the first thing that I would suggest when you're designing materials, particularly like a report or a website, something that's very visual, try to go towards modular design. And by that, I mean dividing the information into easily digestible blocks that sort of logically contain what you're talking about within them. So I'm sure this sounds familiar to y'all. This definitely comes from my background in journalism and publishing. And I feel like we've used the word modular way too often in that field. So I apologize if this is giving anyone like, oh, stop saying modular. But you can see here in this example, what I try to do is put the most important information right at the top in a clear box, and then disperse the other information into their own kind of discrete boxes to help people better understand what they're seeing. So I think we can actually kind of see this even better on the next slide where I have our actual example. So you can see here, the year in review is back. And the way that I do this whenever I design it each year is to first try to figure out how I'm going to put the cost savings in the easiest possible way to understand where they're going to catch people's eyes. So you can see in this box, I put the total cost savings there in a really dark blue box with a bright number, and that's pretty different from the other things on the page. So hopefully that's one of the places that your eye is going towards right away. But then, in addition to the actual number of dollars saved, I think what we really want to emphasize is how much money that's saving our libraries. So you can see the information right below it there in the graph is exactly the same information. It is exactly the same, like how much money we saved, but it's showing you here's visually how much money you would have spent versus this big missing bar of the money that you saved. So I put this in here to say, like, for your most important information, it's okay if you're repeating it or using different visuals to really drive that point home, just so that, one mode might speak to somebody and then a different one might speak to a different person, or they might kind of make a different point when they see it differently. So don't be afraid to kind of show your data in different ways visually to make it more impactful. And then you can also see in this page that I have these boxes on the right-hand side. And the reason that I do that is because usually that box that says 209 member libraries is specific to the library that we're sending this report to. And that is the only information that is individualized to the libraries, at least in this version, like in the 2024 report. So I wanted to make sure it was really clear that the rest of the data was applying to the whole consortium or to the whole community of interest, depending on what it is, and that only the box with the blue box with your library's name on it is your library specifically. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying dividing the data into these little modules can make it a lot easier to be like, oh, this is for my library, this is for the consortium, this is for my community, or something like that. So I think that just helps people understand it a little bit more quickly. And yes, I think that's everything I've got for the slide. So let's look at the next tip. So tip number 2, this one's going to sound a little bit obvious, but stick to your brand. Branding is always going to help your audience recognize you right away. So I would just recommend staying away from a totally different color or font from what you usually use when you're making these materials. And I totally see the temptation to kind of be like, this is its own thing. I can just put our logo on it and make it its own thing. And maybe that will work, but I just find with NC Live stuff, especially, it's really helpful for our member libraries and the stakeholders that we show these to pick it up and see our colors and say like, oh, this is for NC Live. So I think that can really help you communicate like what you're trying to say quickly with those like color and brand recognition, I guess, like symbols or yeah, I can't think of like what the right word is for that, but it's like it's almost like a subconscious like something that you notice. Anyway, now I will acknowledge that it can be tricky if you don't have a ton of brand colors. And NC Live, we have like 5. And and that is, I guess, like a good palette. But basically, since we do this every year, I am always like shuffling through our brand colors to try to make it look different from the previous year, but still NC Live branded. So, for example, the 2023 report was mostly purple. This year is mostly blue. Probably next year it will be mostly purple again. But that's just something that I think no matter what happens is going to help folks recognize like this is from us. And then, of course, making sure your logo is clear and present so that they know where this is coming from. Okay, next tip, please. All right, and then I basically just wanted to mention, because I've been talking about real patrons, anonymized patrons for these testimonials, the value of using real photos when you have them available. I just think it's really easy for the most part for people to tell when you're using stock photos, especially if they're ones that lots of people use. And I think that can accidentally undermine you if you're not careful. So if you are able to use real photos, definitely prioritize that. And especially on like your website or social media, they can be much more valuable than stock photos. But if you don't have photos, what else can you use? I'm a big fan of using bigger text or like graphically interesting text to take the place of an image. So you can see here on the slide with the 3 testimonials The section above that has this like 1.8 billion things graphic that we use. If you've seen the NC Live intro slides, we use that one all the time. And that's just like an interesting thing that kind of pops out. And you can do this with any kind of like, 50% or whatever it may be, just to kind of add some visual interest. And then you don't have to necessarily add a photo because your eye is still drawn to it. Just makes things like a little bit more interesting. And then you don't have to source a photo. The other thing I'll mention, and I think I really touched on this with a couple of slides ago, is that using graphs can also be a great way to put in visuals that aren't going to require a ton of work. So again, you can put that big number like, we saved $47 million. But the graph that shows the cost savings is impactful in a different way. And that does kind of make it more visually interesting to look at. So graphs can be a great way both to help your audience interpret the data really quickly and to just make these more fun to look at and easier to understand. So the other thing I'll just mention about photos, because I'm looking at the stage, is that if you can control your photography, that also tends to be helpful. All three of these testimonials, lovely people, but I just asked them to send me a photo of them to put into this, report. And you can see that when I eventually cropped them, it made their faces very close to the camera. So this is just a cautionary tale to say, like, if you can control the photography, that tends to give you like a better outcome than just asking folks to submit photos. But, you take what you can get. That's okay. All right, I think that brings us kind of to the end here. Let's see. Yes, so I am now happy to answer any questions that y'all have. And I actually have a Mentimeter slide if anyone wants to submit questions anonymously, or I can also take a look in the chat. So I do see one question in the chat already. Someone's asking, are these pictures fake? I'd be concerned about that. Shouldn't that be stated somewhere? And I will say those pictures are real. Those are not fake. That's why it's not on there. But I do think it is best practices to say, like, if you are using something that's AI generated or if you are using a stock photo, to give credit and announce that somewhere on the page. So yes, that is best practice, but the ones I was showing you were actual patron photos. Great. Okay. I see. How do you come up with the savings number? A great question. This is a little bit NC Live specific, so that's why I didn't go into it too much. But the way that we calculate it is that we go to each of our vendors and ask them what our individual libraries would be paying if they bought our collection of resources individually. And so a lot of our cost saving power as a consortium comes from buying collectively because we're representing a whole state of libraries, and vendors would rather sell, obviously to the whole state than to go door to door to every individual library. So we just take what we actually spend versus what our vendors say they would charge each of our libraries if they sold to them individually. Mhm. Oh, okay. I see a follow-up in the chat. Sorry, Linda. The images on the NC extension and Pascal slides, I think somewhere on their websites they do actually say, I'm not sure about Pascal actually, but the extension one they do usually, I think they usually put that on there. But yeah, I would say in general, it's good to put credit or explain what the photos are. Yes, certainly for times that we use stock photos, we try to make that clear. Okay, so somebody else is asking, is there an actual formula you can share to determine ROI? To be honest, that's something that we kind of do, that primarily Claire does with our vendors. So, I mean, to be honest, it's kind of what I verbally just explained, where we add together all of the prices and compare it to our actual cost. So that's truly all that we're doing. But I do know that lots of other library consortia have other kind of methods for calculating their ROI. Some other ones like to put in, other services that they offer, for example, try to determine like the value of that. So it's not like there's one right way to do it. And I would say it's good to kind of shop around and see how other folks are doing it to see if something would fit your organization better. But yeah, it's could be trickier with an individual library depending on what you want to include in your return on investment. Somebody else is asking, will your process change with the new WCAG guidelines for accessibility? I'm not sure which process you're talking about, if someone wants to clarify what you're asking there. Okay, the process for creating graphics, documents, etc. Um, I mean, I guess the short answer is I don't know until the changes happen. Um, but I would guess probably not significantly because we are pretty, I think, active and on top of thinking about the changing guidelines for accessibility and talking to our vendors and making sure that our libraries are up to date on the changes. Um, so I'm not sure how much the changes will affect our collections necessarily. Yeah, I don't suspect that that will change this process very much, but happy to talk about that more. Oh yeah, go ahead, Devin.
Yeah, there's also the ability in Canva to check for accessibility, whether it's like color contrast or heading structure. And I think, we have accessibility webinars coming up in November, talking about accessible document design and accessible websites. So we'll get into the nitty-gritty of that. But I think in terms of a best practice, like if you're making something like checking as you're making it in Canva, or if you're using LibGuides, um, and then checking using Adobe, like the PDF version, if you're going to convert it to a PDF is usually like the best practice. But if you have more questions about like developing graphics and content um, that's accessible from the beginning, we're going to be covering that in November. And then there's just a question here. Do you mostly use Canva to create your graphics?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Devin. I don't know how that I just completely missed what this question was about. I think because at NC Live we do mostly use Google Slides and Canva, which do have accessibility tools, and so it just feels like it's like part of the process. But yeah, just to reiterate what Devin said, we do have training about making accessible documents, accessible web pages, etc. on our training calendar, and I would highly recommend checking those out for more details on how to do that better. And I'm definitely interested in learning more about that as well. To answer the Canva question, yes, I have found it to be extremely useful. I also will say that Canva has made it very easy for me to customize 209 individual library reports last year for that little box that says like your library's particular services. And I'm happy to go into that more if somebody wants to send me an email with particular questions because that was a big learning process. But I like Canva because the interface seems very intuitive to me. I have used other graphic design software before, and just the learning curve seems kind of huge. And then there's changes that I would have to keep up with. So yes. And the other thing is when we make customizable versions of these for our libraries, lots of libraries have Canva and lots of people know how to use it. Excuse me. So it's very easy to send a Canva link to somebody where they can make a copy and then edit it. So it makes it a little bit more, it makes it easier for other folks to like weigh in and customize things too.
Any other questions? All right. Well, we will have Sophie's contact info in case you want to reach out, sophie@nclive.org after the webinar. But thank you all so much for joining us this Monday afternoon. We have 2 more webinars left this week in the Demonstrating Your Library's Value series, one tomorrow afternoon and then one on Wednesday afternoon. So feel free to check those out. Yes, the recording will be shared. And I hope you all have a great rest of your Monday.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.